A recurring complaint about Western culture is that it suffers from a divorce between the head and the heart. The heart here stands for feeling, passion, imagination, and intuition. The head for reason, especially insofar as it is critical of the deliverances of the heart. Signs of a tension between them can be found in virtually every area of modern life, from music to literature, to the technocratic organization of society, to ordinary practices of friendship and romantic love. Above all, they are to be found in the area of religion. Non-believers tend to look upon religious belief as a surrender of the head to the heart. That is, a matter of believing something because one wants or needs it to be true, rather than because of firm rational evidence. Many believers unwittingly encourage this perception by practicing forms of evangelism and worship that give primacy to feeling over rational conviction. On the other hand, philosophies which are opposed to religion, especially those grounded in science, generally make no attempt to address the heart at all. They assume that a stance of neutral, disinterested objectivity is the only one that could possibly be relevant in deciding the fundamental questions of life. The result is that we seem to be faced with the choice between a head-first approach to life and a heart-first approach. Not surprisingly, people find this an impossible choice to make. Their response instead is to compartmentalize. They concede that science and reason ought to govern their public life, but when it comes to matters of feeling, emotion, or personal commitment, they look for guidance elsewhere. My aim in this paper is twofold. First, I wish to describe how the vocabulary of the heart and head entered Western thought. If we understand how this particular way of mapping out the terrain of human existence arose, we will see that there is nothing about it that necessarily implies a conflict between the two poles that it identifies. We will also see that to forestall the possibility of conflict by refusing to acknowledge a separate role for the heart, as in philosophies that derive their inspiration from science, would be a serious mistake. Second, I wish to describe the particular approach to harmonizing the heart and the head that was adopted within the Greek-speaking branch of the Christian tradition during the Middle Ages. As we will see, the Greek church fathers believed that the possibility of a conflict between the heart and the head is part of our fallen human condition. However, they also held that Jesus Christ, as the great unifier of what is disunited, has opened up the possibility of overcoming this division. Let us begin with the heart. Although Greek philosophy has a great deal to say about the passions and emotions, it identifies their source as a faculty or part of the soul, rather than any particular physical organ. It also does not connect the emotions with imagination, intuition, or feeling in the broader sense. The peculiar assumption that these are somehow linked and can be located together in the heart is due to the influence of the Bible. However, what the heart represents in the Bible is different from what it represents in modern thought. We must first understand the biblical idiom in its own right before we can see how it was later transformed. The Hebrew word generally translated heart, leb in its cognates, occurs over 800 times in the Old Testament. Although it is the same name of the physical organ we call the heart, most of its uses are metaphorical. In its broadest sense, it designates the hidden, inaccessible core of something. Thus, one finds the heart of the sea to indicate the depths of the sea, and the heart of the heaven to indicate its unattainable heights. As applied to human beings, it indicates the inner reality of someone as distinct from superficial appearances. The book of Deuteronomy commands, "Thou shalt love thy Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. Meaning that every depth of one's being should actively share in this love. In Isaiah, God complains of the Israelites that they, quote, draw near to me with their mouth and with their lips do honor me, but they have removed their heart far from me. Chapter 29, verse 13. His complaint is not precisely that the Israelites are hypocrites, for it is quite likely that they believe that they are serving him as they ought. It is rather that, despite their words and their conscious thoughts, they are far removed from him in the deepest wellspring of their being. This passage illustrates a point of crucial significance. The heart is hard to know, and indeed it can be fully known only by God. According to 1 Samuel, man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. Chapter 16, verse 7. King Solomon, in his prayer at the dedication of the temple, declares to God that thou only knowest the hearts of the children of men. 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 30. Jeremiah exclaims that the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? He then answers his own question. I, the Lord, search the heart. I try the reins, even to give every man according to his ways and according to the fruit of his doings. Jeremiah chapter 17, 9 through 10. There is an especially interesting example of this view in the book of Daniel. Daniel, in explaining to Nebuchadnezzar the meaning of a dream by which Nebuchadnezzar had been deeply troubled, states that God had revealed it to him, to Daniel, that thou might know the thoughts of thy heart. Daniel chapter 2, verse 30. In other words, it is Daniel's role as prophet to reveal to Nebuchadnezzar that which is deepest within him. This is not to suggest that there is no connection between the heart and outward deeds. Actions express what is in the heart, and to some extent they even shape what is in the heart. Moses tells the Israelites that God made them wander in the wilderness to know what was in thine heart, whether thou would keep his commandments. In light of the passages just mentioned, he could scarcely be suggesting that God did not already know their hearts, insofar as these could be known. I take it what he means is that their years in the wilderness were a period of trial during which, as a result of their actions, their hearts took on a definite and knowable form. So far, the biblical conception of the heart is not too different from the modern conception. Most people today would tend to agree that the heart is deep and hard to know, although it expresses itself in action and to some extent can also be shaped by its action. One point on which the biblical conception is sharply different from the modern conception, however, is that in the Bible, the heart has no particular connection with emotion. Because it is the whole person at his deepest level, it is the seat not only of the emotions, but also of reason, intelligence, and desire. In fact, the Bible draws little distinction among these different functions. The book of Proverbs commands, O ye simple, understand wisdom, and ye fools, be ye of an understanding heart. The context makes plain that to be of an understanding heart is not primarily a matter of mental acuity, but of the possession of rightly ordered intentions and desires. The reason that this is seen as a form of understanding is that for them to be rightly ordered requires that they be formed in light of the knowledge of God. Later in the same book, we find, a man's heart deviseth his way, but the Lord directs his steps. Chapter 16, verse 9. Here, too, the heart is the organ of rationally informed desire, no more or less intellective than volitional and desiderative. The same is true when we read that David's heart smote him because he had cut off Saul's skirt. In 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 5. The guilt that David feels is the product equally of his reason, will, and desire. In saying that his heart smote him, the author conveys first that the guilt is present at a deeper level than the relatively superficial thoughts that had led him to perform the act itself. And second, that it affects David so completely that he feels it as a physical blow, albeit one coming from within. It is in light of both the depth of the heart and its holistic integrity that we can understand the supreme importance of a heart that is rightly ordered. When in Jeremiah God promises of the Israelites, "I will give them a heart to know me," he means not primarily that they will know about God, but that they will know him by responding to his direction and feeling his presence. Thus, the heart can have a more or less receptive condition insofar as it is or is not responsive to God. In Ezekiel, the change between these two states is put in terms of an actual replacement of the heart. I will take a stony heart out of their flesh, and I will give them a heart of flesh, that they may walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and do them, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God. A heart of flesh is not only one that is healthy and functioning properly, but one that is readily moved rather than being cold and insensitive. Without such a heart, any real communication between man and God is impossible. In light of the holistic nature of the heart in the Bible, how has it come to be contrasted so sharply to the mind? To answer that question, we must consider the growth of the concept of the mind. Here I will focus particularly on the Greek term nous, the most common term for mind in the New Testament. Actually, it bears a range of meanings: mind, reason, understanding, thought, judgment, resolve, and disposition. The best way to get a handle on this range of possibilities is to think of its meaning as related in various ways to the act of understanding. Specifically, it ranges from A, the faculty of understanding, to B, the characteristic way that faculty is exercised, to C, a particular act of its exercise, to D, the virtue of exercising it well. For example, when St. Paul quotes from the Greek translation of Isaiah, "Who has known the nous of the Lord?" 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 16, he would seem to be referring to C, the specific content of the divine mind. When he then goes on to declare triumphantly, "But we have the mind of Christ," he probably refers instead to B, a characteristic way of thinking. He may hint as well that we share in A, Christ's very faculty of understanding, since otherwise our sharing in his way of thinking could be merely a temporary or accidental fact. For our purposes, there are two important points to notice. The first is that because of this range of meanings, nous does not stand in opposition to feeling or emotion in the same way as does mind in English. St. Paul often attaches to it a moral character, speaking of a fleshy mind, or nous, a corrupt mind, or a mind that has been tested and found unworthy. He does not refer here merely to failings of the intellect, but to a habitual tendency to think and feel in ways that are self-serving or morally debased. The same is true in the opposite sense of the mind of Christ. It is not so much a distinctive intellectual ability as a way of thinking and feeling that is in service to Christ and takes him as its model. The second point to notice is that because nous possesses a moral and spiritual character, our current fallen nous is in need of transformation. One of the most familiar verses in the New Testament is that where St. Paul commands, "Be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind," or nous, "that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." Romans 12, chapter 12, verse 2. Here, the renewing of the mind results not so much in a new intellectual ability as in a practical understanding of the will of God that is effective within the sphere of action. Elsewhere, Paul directs his audience to be renewed in the spirit of your mind, nous, and to put on the new man, which after God is created in righteousness and true holiness. Here, too, the renewal of the mind is a thoroughgoing transformation that brings one into conformity with the will of God. In both passages, Paul assumes that the world, which constitutes our normal and habitual sphere of reference, roughly, the values and expectations that are thrust upon us by society, will not be helpful in this endeavor. What we need is not more of what we already are, but a radical transformation. It is plain that the biblical contrast between the heart and the mind is not at all that between feeling and thought. It is rather that between the core of what we are and our phenomenal consciousness, composed as it is of thoughts, emotions, feelings, and desires, whether habitual or transitory. Already we can see how the notion of drawing the mind into the heart might make sense on such a view. Before turning to the Greek fathers, one further point which needs clarifying is the different ways in which the mind and the heart relate to God. We have seen that both of them can be more or less pure, that both are in need of some kind of transformation. The Greek fathers were primarily concerned with the different ways this is true in each case, and how the transformation of each must work together before they can coalesce into a unity. Let's consider what biblical motivation there might be for such a view. I have mentioned God's promise in Ezekiel that he will take away the stony heart of the Israelites and give them a heart of flesh. Although this language is metaphorical, it is also closely tied to an awareness of the heart as a physical organ, one that we do not see but that we depend upon in all that we do, and that occasionally, when it is agitated, we can feel its physical presence. The physicality of the heart is thus an essential component of its meaning. Perhaps the most vivid example of how the heart, as a spiritual organ, cannot be separated from the physical organ is an episode in the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah has been placed in the stocks and publicly ridiculed for his prophecies. Since it was his attempt to obey God that brought him to this point, he places the blame for what has been done to him squarely upon God, saying, "O Lord, thou hast deceived me, and I was deceived. Thou art stronger than I, and hast prevailed. I am in derision daily. Everyone mocketh me." Chapter 20, verse 7. He then adds that he had resolved to speak God's word no more, but the word itself would not allow him. Quote, "Then I said, I will not make mention of him, nor speak any more in his name. But his word was in mine heart as a burning fire, shut up in my bones, and I was weary with forbearing, and I could not stay." In other words, could not refrain from speaking. Chapter 20, verse 9. His word was in mine heart as a burning fire shut up in my bones. The heart here is not only a metaphor for the deepest level of his being, it is also the physical organ itself, one that Jeremiah's conscious mind cannot escape or overrule, however much he might wish to do so. The fact that the heart is a physical organ which we do not see, but whose power wells up from within us, makes it mysterious in a way that the mind is not. In the New Testament, where the polarity of the heart and mind is much more prominent than in the Old Testament, this sense of the heart as a mystery grows even stronger. Jesus, in rebuking the Pharisees, observes that their words have an appearance of righteousness but do not witness to a good heart. O generation of vipers, how can ye, being evil, speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaketh. A good man out of the good treasure of the heart bring forth good things, and an evil man out of the evil treasure bring forth evil things. Matthew chapter 12, verses 34 through 35. He later elaborates, out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man. Chapter 15, verse 19 through 20. No doubt the Pharisees believed that they were righteous, but their words and deeds revealed otherwise. The heart is thus a mystery deep within a person, from which well up thoughts and actions that even the person himself may not fully understand. It is also an organ of perception, one that is capable of receiving mysteries in a way that the conscious mind is not. After the birth of Jesus, accompanied as it was by the appearance of a multitude of heavenly hosts, Mary kept all these things and pondered them in her heart. Luke chapter 2, verse 19. The word translated pondered is sambalusa, literally drawing together. Mary draws all that she has seen and heard into her heart, where its meaning will unfold, not so much intellectually as by her continual act of living in light of it. Much later in the same gospel, after the resurrection of Jesus, he appears to his disciples and explains to them the prophecies pertaining to himself. When they at last realize who he is, he vanishes, and they exclaim to one another, "Did not our heart burn within us while he talked to us by the way, and while he opened to us the scriptures?" Chapter 24, verse 32. Here too, it is the heart that recognizes and receives the mysteries that Jesus reveals. The fact that as it does so, it burns within us, indicates that just as with Jeremiah, the heart is still very much a physical organ as well as a place of spiritual receptivity. Finally, we must mention the letters of St. Paul, where the heart as an organ of spiritual receptivity is a recurrent theme. Paul speaks of God as giving the earnest of the Spirit in our hearts, as having shined in our hearts, and as having sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. He describes the new Christians in Corinth as an epistle written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not in tables of stone, but in fleshy tables of the heart. Like Luke, he understands the heart as capable of receiving and understanding mysteries in a way surpassing the mind. Thus, he prays for the Ephesians that the eyes of your heart be enlightened, that ye may know what is the hope of his God's calling, and what the riches of the glory of his inheritance in the saints. Later, he urges them not to be like those who are alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them because of the hardness of their heart. Chapter 4, verse 18. In speaking of the heart as an organ of spiritual receptivity, I mean to emphasize its physical character. In this, it contrasts with the mind, which is instead, as in Paul's teaching about the renewal of the mind, a faculty of spiritual receptivity. The difference is that, as an organ, the heart is part of our physical makeup, something that we did not choose and cannot readily change. Indeed, it is so deep within us that we do not fully know its contents or understand what it utters. Only God, who searches the heart, is capable of knowing it fully and transforming it through His love. The mind, as the level of conscious awareness, is more immediately subject to our control, yet is also subject to self-deception. This means that if the heart has received the Spirit of God, as prophesied in the Old Testament and proclaimed boldly by St. Paul, then if the mind is alienated from the heart, it will also be alienated from God. Let us now turn to the Greek Fathers. One who speaks extensively of the heart is the unknown 4th century author, conventionally referred to as Macarius, of the Macarian homilies. Macarius has a vivid sense of the capacity of the heart for both good and evil. The heart itself is but a small vessel, yet there are also dragons and there are lions. There are poisonous beasts and all the treasures of evil. And there are rough and uneven roads. There are precipices, but there is also God, also the angels, the life and the kingdom, the light and the apostles, the treasures of grace. There are all things. He likens the heart to an enclosed garden outside of which is a fast-moving river. If the river eats away at the foundations of the wall will be destroyed and the garden flooded. Quote, "So it is also within man's heart. It has good thoughts, but the rivers of evil are always flowing near the heart, seeking to bring it down and to draw it to its own side." If the mind should be turned ever so little toward frivolity and yield to unclean thoughts, look out. The spirits of error have roamed the pasture land and have entered and have overturned there the beautiful things. Unquote. To guard the heart, one must guard the mind, keeping it from evil thoughts. Elsewhere, he alters the metaphor slightly, describing how, just as a gardener who works hard must still look to heaven for rain, we too must work the soil of the heart by free deliberation and hard work, while recognizing that without grace, our labors can bring nothing. Ultimately, it is only through the heart that grace can penetrate our whole being, including the body. Macarius explains, the heart directs all the organs of the body, and when grace gains possession of the heart, it rules over all of the members of the body and the thoughts. For there, in the heart, the mind abides as well as the thoughts of the soul and all of its hopes. This is how grace penetrates throughout all of the parts of the body. The necessity of guarding the heart through watchfulness over one's thoughts becomes a major theme in later authors. As an example, we may take St. Hesychius of Sinai, 8th or 9th century, whose work on watchfulness and holiness was highly popular in the monastic tradition. Hesychius explains, watchfulness is a continual fixing and halting of thought at the entrance to the heart. In this way, predatory and murderous thoughts are marked down as they approach, and what they say and do is noted. And we can see in what specious and delusive form the demons are trying to deceive the intellect. Following a number of earlier authors, Hesychius holds that purity is the intellect's natural state, so that watchfulness is not an unnatural restraint, but instead a return to our natural condition. He writes, "In this way the soul can attain in the Lord that state of beauty, loveliness, and integrity in which it was created by God in the beginning. As Antony the great servant of God, said, "Holiness is achieved when the intellect is in its natural state." And shortly after this, he adds, "Let us purify our minds, for I believe that when the mind is completely pure and in its natural state, it gains penetrating insight, and it sees more clearly and further than the demons, since the Lord reveals things to it." St. Hezekiah adds, however, that to attain purity of heart also requires the aid of Christ. Quote, "It is impossible to find the Red Sea among the stars, or to walk this earth without breathing air. So too it is impossible to cleanse our heart from impassioned thoughts and to expel its spiritual enemies without the frequent invocation of Jesus Christ." Unquote. Here he has in mind less the imitation of Christ as a model than the frequent, indeed constant, invocation of Christ in prayer. He explains, "A certain God-given equilibrium is produced in our intellect through the constant remembrance and invocation of our Lord Jesus Christ, provided that we do not neglect this constant spiritual entreaty or our close watchfulness and diligence. Indeed, our true task is always the same and is always accomplished in the same way, to call upon our Lord Jesus Christ with a burning heart so that his holy name intercedes for us." The name of Jesus gladdens the earth of our heart, like rain falling on the earth, making it soft and pliable. Besides seeking Christ's aid, invoking him constantly is also a way of keeping the intellect occupied while freeing it from the need for thoughts, that is, mental images which can never distract it from God. The goal is that the invocation of Jesus becomes a prayer which is ever active in the inner shrine of the soul. Ultimately, then, none but Jesus Christ himself, unifier of what is disunited, can give your heart lasting peace from passions. Such constant invocation of Jesus, seeking to establish his name as a prayer which is ever active within the heart, is known as the Jesus Prayer. The last author I shall cite is St. Gregory Palamas, who more than anyone else articulated the intellectual foundations of the monastic practice of the Jesus Prayer. Palamas quotes the words of St. Macarius about how when grace gains possession of the heart, it rules over all the members and all of the thoughts. And then he continues, "Thus our heart is the place of the rational faculty, the first rational organ of the body. Consequently, when we seek to keep watch over and correct our reason by a rigorous sobriety, with what are we to keep watch if we do not gather together our mind, which has been dissipated abroad by the senses, and lead it back again into the interior, to the same self-heart, which is the seat of the thoughts? This is why," Macarius immediately goes on to say, "it is there one must look to see if grace has inscribed the laws of the Spirit. Where but in the heart, the controlling organ, the throne of grace, where the mind and all the thoughts of the soul are to be found?" On the one hand, the heart is the natural seat of the mind, the first rational organ of the body. On the other, our mind in its current state has been dissipated abroad by the senses. The only solution is to lead the mind back into the heart by constant watchfulness over one's thoughts and by constantly invoking the aid of Jesus. In this way, what I referred to earlier as the faculty of spiritual receptivity will again be centered in the organ of spiritual receptivity, where God especially imparts the gift of grace. Plainly, for the Greek fathers, drawing the mind into the heart has nothing to do with a surrender or sentimentality. It requires rigorous watchfulness over one's thoughts and feelings, rejecting any that are alien to divine grace. However, it is also not simply a process of mental self-correction. There is a real physical connection to be made, one that is only possible because we are both physical and spiritual beings, and our spirituality is incomplete if it does not permeate our physical being. This means that the mind and the heart must come to act as one, each in its own proper way, responding to divine grace. Then, in the words of St. Macarius, grace will issue from the heart and penetrate through all the parts of the body. I have focused on Eastern Christianity because I believe it is there that the biblical understanding of the mind and the heart reaches its fullest expression. Regrettably, the points that I have attributed to the Greek fathers, the emphasis on the heart as the channel of divine grace, the use of the Jesus prayer, the goal of drawing the mind into the heart, have played little role within Western Christianity. Indeed, to Western ears, the statement of Palamas that the heart is the first rational organ of the body has a distinctly paradoxical ring. That is because we have grown accustomed to contrasting the heart as the locus of feeling with the mind as the locus of reason. I believe that many of the ills of Western culture can be attributed to this grave distortion of biblical teaching. The Greek fathers present us with a theology of the mind and heart that never lost touch with its biblical roots. By doing so, they offer hope that we can again unite thought and feeling into a living whole.